Chapter 4, of Athos and his shoulder. Of Porthos and his baldric, and of Aramis and his handkerchief. Mad with anger, D'Artagnan crossed the office in the 3 leaps and was darting toward the stairs, expecting to clear them 4 at a time, when, in his furious rush, he collided head foremost with a musketeer who was coming out of one of Monsieur de Treville's private rooms. As D'Artagnan butted the man's shoulder violently, the other uttered a cry, or rather a howl. "Excuse me," said D'Artagnan, trying to start off again. "Excuse me, but I am in a hurry." He had scarcely gone down the first step when a hand of iron seized him by the belt. "Oh, you're in a hurry, eh?" said the musketeer, blanching. "You're in a hurry, so you run right into me and you say excuse me, and you expect me to take it? Not at all, my lad. You heard Monsieur de Treville speak somewhat cavalierly to us today, and you think we can take that sort of thing from anybody. Let me set you right. Comrade, you are not Monsieur de Treville." D'Artagnan recognized Athos, who, having had his wounds dressed by the doctor, was on his way home. "I assure you I did not do it on purpose." D'Artagnan apologized, as it was an accident. "I said excuse me. I should think that was sufficient apology. Once more, I say I am in a very great hurry, on my honor. And I'll not say it again. Let me go, please. Let me go about my business, monsieur." "You are far from courteous," Athos replied, loosing his hold of him. "It is obvious that you are newly come from some remote province." D'Artagnan had already gone down several steps, but at this remark he stopped short. "Morbleu, monsieur," he growled, "I may come from a distance, but I warn you, you are not the man to give me lessons in deportment. Perhaps, if I were not in such a hurry, and if I were not chasing somebody, monsieur the gentleman in a great hurry, you can find me again, without running after me, if you see what I mean." "And where, if you please?" "Near the Carmes de Cox, you know, the Carmelite convent." "At what time?" "About noon." "About noon. Very well, I shall be there." "Try to be punctual, because if you make me wait till 1/4 past, I shall cut your ears off as you run." "Good, I shall be there at 10 to 12, and D'Artagnan set off as though borne by the devil, confident that he would overtake the man of Meung whom he had seen sauntering down the street. But at the main gate, he saw Porthos talking to the soldier on guard. Between the two of them, there was just room for a man to pass. D'Artagnan, thinking he could whisk through, shot forward like an arrow between them. Unfortunately he had not reckoned with the wind. As he was about to pass, a gust blew out the portly musketeer's long cloak, and D'Artagnan landed right in the middle of it. Porthos doubtless had his own reasons for not wishing to abandon this essential part of his costume, for instead of releasing the flap he held in his hand, he pulled it toward him. D'Artagnan was thus rolled up inside the velvet by a rotatory movement attributable to the persistency of Porthos. Hearing the musketeer swear, he tried to emerge from under the cloak which was blinding him, and sought to find his way from under its folds. Above all, he must avoid marring the virgin freshness of the baldric Porthos set such store by. Opening his eyes timidly, he found his nose glued between the musketeer's shoulders, flat against the baldric. Alas, like most things in this world which have but appearance in their favor, the baldric was aglitter with gold in front, but behind it was of ordinary buff. Vainglorious as he was, if Porthos could not afford a baldric wholly of gold, he would have at least 1/2 of it. This explained the necessity of the cold he had complained of and the urgency of the cloak he sported. "Vertubleu, you must be crazy to crash into people this way," Porthos grumbled as D'Artagnan kept wriggling behind him. "Excuse me," said D'Artagnan, reappearing from under the giant's shoulder, "but I am in a great hurry. I was running after somebody and you always go blind when you run, I suppose." "No," D'Artagnan answered, somewhat nettled. "In fact, thanks to my eyes, I can see a good many things other people don't." He did not care whether Porthos understood the allusion or not. At all events, the musketeer gave free rein to his anger. "Monsieur, I warn you, you stand an excellent chance of being disemboweled if you try pushing a musketeer about." "Disemboweled? That's strong language, monsieur. It befits a man accustomed to looking his enemies in the face." "Ha, that's no light." D'Artagnan laughed. "Certainly you wouldn't show them your back," and enchanted with his wit, he went off, still chuckling over the semi-golden baldric. Porthos, foaming with rage, was about to fall upon him. Later, D'Artagnan admonished, "When you haven't your cloak on." "At 1 o'clock." "Then, behind the Luxembourg." "Very well. Then, at 1 o'clock." D'Artagnan turned the corner of the street, looking carefully ahead and up and down the cross street. Slowly though the stranger had walked, he must still have outdistanced D'Artagnan while the Gascon was being detained by Athos and Porthos, or he must have entered some house nearby. D'Artagnan inquired of passers-by if they had seen a person answering his enemy's description. He walked down as far as the ferry, came up again along the Rue des Nains and across the Croix Rouge, but he found nothing, absolutely nothing. Yet this wild goose chase helped him in a sense, for, fast as the beads of sweat ran down his forehead, his heart began to cool. He retraced all the events that had occurred. They were numerous and ill-omened. It was scarcely 11 o'clock in the morning, and yet in 2 short hours he had made 3 capital blunders. In the first place, he had disgraced himself in the eyes of Monsieur de Treville, who could not but consider his withdrawal somewhat cavalier. In the second and third, he had invited dangerous duels with 2 men, each capable of slaying 3 D'Artagnans, with 2 musketeers, in short, with 2 of those heroes he admired so passionately that they throned it in his mind and heart over all others. A sad plight. Certain of being killed by Athos, he was naturally unperturbed about Porthos, but as hope is the last thing a man will relinquish, D'Artagnan hoped against hope that he might survive both these duels, even though grievously wounded. Should this happen, he would profit by the following homily delivered by himself to himself. "What a lunatic I was, and what a clod I am! Poor brave Athos was wounded in the shoulder, and I was fated to butt against it. Why he did not kill me then and there, God knows. He had ample cause to. I must have caused him fearful pain. As for Porthos, dear old Porthos, my run-in with him was the drollest thing that ever happened to me." At the thought, the youth could not help roaring with laughter, but he looked very carefully about him to make sure lest his solitary laughter, unaccountable to any passer-by, be considered offensive. Funny it was, surely, but that doesn't make me any less of a driveling idiot. People simply don't go charging into others without warning, and they don't dive under their cloaks to search for what isn't there. Porthos would certainly have excused me if I hadn't alluded to his cursed baldric. To be sure, I didn't refer to it specifically. I employed subtle insinuation and hilarious innuendo. Ah, cursed Gascon that I am! I would crack a joke as I fried on the griddles of hell. His mirth spent, he continued to talk to himself with all the amenity he believed to be his due. "Look here, D'Artagnan my friend, if you escape, which seems to me highly improbable, you must learn to be perfectly polite in the future. You must henceforth be admired and cited as a model of urbanity. To be mannerly and obliging does not make a man a coward. Look at Aramis. He is amiability and grace personified. Well, has anyone ever dreamed of calling him a coward? Certainly not, and I vow that from now on I shall take him as a model in everything. Ah, here he is, walking forward and soliloquizing." D'Artagnan had arrived a few steps from the Hôtel des Guillaumes and found Aramis by the main gate chatting gaily with 3 gentlemen of the Royal Guards. Aramis, for his part, perceived D'Artagnan too, but remembering that the youth had witnessed the angry scene with Monsieur de Treville that morning, he felt loath to welcome one who had observed the captain rebuking his musketeers, so he pretended not to see him. D'Artagnan, on the contrary, was still full of his plans of conciliation and courtesy, so with a deep bow and a most gracious smile, he approached the quartet. Aramis bowed his head slightly but did not smile. The four soldiers immediately broke off their conversation. D'Artagnan at once perceived that he was intruding upon them, but he was not familiar enough with the manners of the fashionable world to know how to extricate himself gallantly from a false position. Here he was, mingling with people he scarcely knew and interrupting a conversation that did not concern him. He was racking his brains to find the least awkward means of retreat when he noticed that Aramis had dropped his handkerchief and, doubtless by mistake, had placed his foot over it. Here, thought D'Artagnan, was a favorable opportunity to make up for his tactlessness. With the most polished air he could summon, he stooped and drew the handkerchief from under the Musketeer's foot, despite the efforts Aramis made to keep it hidden. Holding it out to Aramis, he said, "Here, monsieur, is a handkerchief I believe you should be sorry to lose." Indeed, the handkerchief was richly embroidered and one of the corners bore a coronet and crest. Aramis, blushing excessively, snatched it from the Gascon's hand. "Ah, my most discreet friend," one of the guards said to Aramis, "will you persist in saying that you are not on good terms with Madame de Bois Tracy when that charming lady is kind enough to lend you one of her handkerchiefs?" The glance Aramis shot at D'Artagnan was a declaration of mortal enmity. Then, resuming his usual suave air, "You are in error, gentlemen," he answered. "This handkerchief does not belong to me. I cannot imagine what maggot inspired monsieur to hand it to me rather than to one of you. As proof of what I say, here is mine in my pocket." Whereupon he produced his own handkerchief, which was very elegant too and of fine cambric, though that material was expensive at the period, but it lacked both embroidery and a crest. As he held it up, they could all see it was ornamented with a single cipher, its owner's. This time D'Artagnan was not so hasty. He perceived his mistake, but the others refused to be convinced by the Musketeer's denial. One of them addressed the Musketeer with affected seriousness. "If matters were as you pretend, my dear Aramis, I should be forced to ask you to hand over that handkerchief. Bois Tracy is an intimate friend of mine and I will not allow his wife's property to be sported as a trophy." "Your demand is ill-couched," Aramis retorted. "While I recognize the justice of your claim, I refuse it on account of the form. The fact is," D'Artagnan hazarded timidly, "I did not see the handkerchief fall from the pocket of Monsieur Aramis. He had his foot on it, that is all." "Seeing his foot on it, I thought it was his, and you were completely mistaken, monsieur," Aramis replied coldly, indifferent to D'Artagnan's efforts at reparation. Then, turning to the gentleman who had declared himself the friend of Bois Tracy, "Is for you, monsieur the friend of Bois Tracy. It occurs to me that I am on quite as intimate terms with him as you are. Thus this handkerchief might have fallen just as easily out of your pocket as out of mine." "No, on my honor as a gentleman." "You are about to swear on your honor and I on my word, which will make it evident that one of us is lying." "Look here, Montaran, we can't do better than that. Let us each take one half of the handkerchief." "Certainly." The other two guardsmen were enchanted. "Quite right. Perfectly fair. The judgment of Solomon." "Aramis, you are certainly exceeding wise." As they all burst out laughing, the affair, as may be supposed, had no untoward sequel. After a moment or two, the conversation ceased. The three guardsmen and the musketeer shook hands cordially and went off in opposite directions. D'Artagnan, meanwhile, stood sheepishly to one side. "Now is my chance to make my peace with this gallant gentleman," D'Artagnan thought, and, agog with good intent, he hurried after Aramis, who had moved off without paying any attention to him. "Monsieur, you will excuse me, I hope." "Monsieur, Allow me to observe that your behavior in this circumstance was not that of a gentleman. What, monsieur? Do you suppose? I suppose you are not a fool, monsieur. I also suppose that, though you come from Gascony, you must know that people do not step upon handkerchiefs without a reason. What the devil? The streets of Paris are not paved with cambric. Monsieur, you are wrong in trying to humiliate me, D'Artagnan replied, his natural aggressive spirit gaining the upper hand over his pacific resolutions. I am from Gascony, it is true. Since you know this, I need not tell you that Gascons are anything but patient. When a Gascon has begged to be excused once, even for a foolish act, he is convinced that he has already done once again as much as he should have. Monsieur, what I said was not said in order to pick a quarrel with you. I am no bravo. Thank God, I am but a temporary musketeer. As much, I fight only when I am forced to, and always with the greatest repugnance. But this time the affair is serious because you have compromised a lady. Because we have compromised a lady, you mean? Why were you so tactless as to give me back the handkerchief? Why were you so clumsy as to drop it? I said, and I repeat, monsieur, that the handkerchief was never in my pocket. Well, monsieur, you have lied twice, for I saw it fall. Ha! So that's the tone you assume, monsieur the Gascon. Well, I shall have to teach you how to behave yourself, and I shall send you back to Mass, monsieur l'Abbé, to a Mass said over your corpse. Draw, if you please, and instantly. No, no, if you please, my fair friend. At least not here. Can't you see that we are opposite the Hôtel d'Aiguillon, which is filled with a rabble of Monseigneur Cardinal's servants? How do I know that His Eminence has not deputed you to procure him my head? To tell you the truth, I am ridiculously attached to this head of mine. It seems to fit so symmetrically upon my shoulders. Of course I intend to kill you. Don't worry on that score. But in a cozy, remote place where we will not be interrupted lest you be inclined to boast about your death in public. I agree, monsieur, but do not be too confident, and bring along your handkerchief, whether it belongs to you or to somebody else. You will probably need it. Monsieur is a Gascon? Yes, this monsieur is a Gascon, and he never postpones a duel through prudence. Prudence, monsieur, is a somewhat useless virtue for musketeers. I know, but it is indispensable to churchmen. Therefore, as I am only a musketeer pro tem, I intend to remain prudent. At 2 o'clock I shall have the honor of waiting for you at the Hôtel de Treville. There, I shall apprise you of the best place and time we can meet. The two young men bowed and parted. Aramis went up the street which led to the Luxembourg. D'Artagnan, having suddenly noticed the time, set out toward the Carmes-Deschamps. Decidedly, I shall not return, he mused, but at least if I am killed, I shall be killed by a musketeer. Chapter 5. His Majesty's Musketeers and the Cardinal's Guards. D'Artagnan did not know a soul in Paris. He therefore went to his appointment with Athos without a second to support him, let alone two, content with those whom his adversary would have chosen for himself. Besides, he fully intended to offer the brave musketeer all suitable apologies, without weakness or servility of course, for he feared the usual outcome of an affair of this sort. When a young, vigorous man fights against one who is weak from his wounds, if conquered, he doubles the value of his adversary's triumph. If victorious, he is accused of having taken an unfair advantage of a handicap. Now, unless we have painted the character of our seeker after adventures unsatisfactorily, our readers must already have noted that D'Artagnan was no ordinary man. Therefore, while he kept repeating to himself that his death was inevitable, he was not going tamely and submissively to death as a man less courageous might have done in his place. Thinking over the different characters of the men he was about to fight against, he gained a clearer view of the situation. By offering sincere apology, he hoped to make a friend of Athos, whose lordly air and austere bearing he admired immensely, unless he were killed outright. He flattered himself that he could frighten Porthos with the adventure of the baldric, an anecdote which, cleverly presented, could be told to everybody with the certainty of covering its master with ridicule. As for the astute Aramis, D'Artagnan was not seriously afraid of him. If I manage to last until I get to him, I shall dispatch him blithely, he murmured. At any rate, I shall aim at his face, which was Caesar's advice to his soldiers before they joined battle with Pompey's. At worst, I shall at least have damaged the handsome aim he is so proud of. Further, D'Artagnan was armed with that invincible stock of a determination his father had communicated to him. He remembered the old hero's exact words: "Endure nothing from anyone save Monseigneur, Cardinal and the King." Sped by this counsel, he flew rather than walked toward the monastery of the Carmes de Casses, or barefoot Carmelite friars, which, in those days, was known as the Carmes des Chacs. It was a building innocent of windows and surrounded by barren fields, less frequented than the Pré-aux-Clercs as a dueling ground, and usually chosen by men who had no time to lose. When D'Artagnan arrived in sight of the bare space extending along the foot of the monastery wall, Athos had been waiting only 5 minutes. 12 o'clock was striking. D'Artagnan was therefore as punctual as the woman of Samaria and as the most rigorously casuistic of duelists might wish. Though Monsieur de Treville's physician had dressed the Musketeers' wounds afresh, he was still suffering. D'Artagnan found him seated on the stone, waiting with that placidity and dignity which never forsook him. Seeing D'Artagnan draw near, Athos rose and came courteously to meet him. D'Artagnan, for his part, took off his hat and bowed so deeply that its feathers swept the ground. "Monsieur, I have engaged 2 of my friends as seconds, but they have not arrived yet. I am surprised at the delay. It is not at all their custom." "Monsieur," D'Artagnan answered, "I have no seconds. I arrived in Paris just yesterday. The only person I know in the city is Monsieur de Treville. I was recommended to him by my father, who has the honor of being a tolerably close friend of his." After a moment's reflection, Athos asked, "Monsieur de Treville is the only person you know?" "Yes, monsieur. Look here, look here," Athos grumbled. He was addressing D'Artagnan, yet half of what he said was for his own benefit. "If I kill you, I shall be taken for a child-slaying ogre? Everybody will swear that hieroglyph. No one will say our fight was too one-sided." D'Artagnan protested with a bow not devoid of dignity. "After all, you are doing me the honor of crossing swords with me, although your wounds must be giving you considerable trouble." "Eh, it is all very troublesome, I must confess, and you hurt me devilishly when you charged into me, but I shall fence with my left hand. I usually do so in such circumstances. Please do not think I am doing you a favor. I am either-handed. In fact, you will be at a disadvantage. Left-handers can be pretty irksome for those who are not used to them." "Monsieur," said D'Artagnan, bowing again, "I assure you I am immensely grateful to you for your perfect courtesy." "You are too kind," Athos replied. "Ever the gentleman. Let us speak of something else, if you please." Then, as a twinge of pain seized him, "Sanglo," he cried, "you certainly hurt me. My shoulder is on fire. If you would permit me?" D'Artagnan ventured timidly. "What, monsieur?" "I have a miraculous balm for wounds. My mother gave it to me. I have had occasion to try it on myself." Well, I am certain that in less than 3 days this balm would cure you." "Monsieur, after 3 days, when you are cured, I would still deem it a great honor to cross swords with you." D'Artagnan spoke with a simplicity that did honor to his courtesy without casting the least doubt upon his courage. "God's truth, monsieur, there's a proposition I cannot but admire. Not that I accept it, but none save a gentleman born could have made it. That is how the paladins spoke in the days of Charlemagne. and were they not the very paradigm of chivalry? Unfortunately, we do not live in the days of the great emperor. We live under the rule of a cardinal. However carefully we might try to guard our secret, people would learn we were about to fight and we would be prevented from doing so. He frowned as he looked at the horizon. Confound it, will these fellows never come? If you are in a hurry, monsieur, D'Artagnan suggested in the same polite tone he had used before, we might set to without your seconds. Do not stand upon ceremony. You may dispatch me as soon as you care to. I like you for those words, said Athos, nodding graciously. They came from an intelligent mind and a generous heart. Monsieur, I prize men of your mettle. I see plainly that if we do not kill each other, I shall hereafter have much pleasure conversing with you. But let us wait for my friends, if you please. I have plenty of time and it would be more seemly. He had barely finished speaking when, looking up, here comes one of them, he cried, as, to his surprise, D'Artagnan discerned the gigantic bulk of Porthos at the far end of the Rue de Vaugirard. What, is Monsieur Porthos one of your seconds? Certainly. Does that disturb you? No, by no means. And here comes the second one. As D'Artagnan turned to follow the direction in which Athos was pointing, he perceived Aramis. What? He cried, even more astonished than before. Monsieur, Aramis is your other second? Of course. Don't you know that none of us is ever seen without the others? Musketeers and guards, the court and the city know us as the three inseparables. Of course, as you come from Dax or Pau. From Tarbes. From Tarbes. Then, you are probably unaware of this fact. By my troth, you are well named, gentlemen, and my adventure, should it make a stir, will certainly prove that your union is not founded upon contrasts. Meanwhile Porthos came up, waved his hand to Athos, then, noticing D'Artagnan, stopped short, gaping with surprise. Incidentally he had changed his baldric and left off his cloak. Well, bless me, what does this mean? He asked. This is the gentleman I am to fight with, Athos explained, pointing to D'Artagnan, then opening his palm in a gesture of salutation. But I am going to fight with him too, not before 1 o'clock, monsieur, D'Artagnan reminded him. And I too am to fight with this gentleman, Aramis announced, joining the group. Not until 2 o'clock, D'Artagnan replied as casually as before. Aramis turned to Athos. By the way, Athos, what are you fighting about? By my faith, I'm none too sure. As a matter of fact, he heard my shoulder. What about you, Porthos? I'm fighting. Porthos blushed to deep crimson. I'm fighting because I'm fighting. Athos, whose keen eye lost no detail of the scene, observed a faint sly smile steal over the young Gascon's lips as he specified, we had a slight disagreement about dress, and you, Aramis? Oh, ours is a theological quarrel. Aramis made a sign to D'Artagnan begging him to keep the cause of their difference a secret. Athos saw a second smile flit across D'Artagnan's lips. Indeed, yes. D'Artagnan agreed, a passage in St. Augustine upon which we could not concur. A clever fellow, this Gascon, no doubt about it, Athos murmured under his breath. And now that we are all here, gentlemen, D'Artagnan announced, allow me to offer you my apologies. At the word apologies, a cloud passed over the brow of Athos. A haughty smile curled the lips of Porthos, and a nod of refusal from Aramis proved more expressive than any words he might have said. One moment, gentlemen, you do not understand me, D'Artagnan objected, as he tossed back his head. The sunlight fell upon it, emphasizing its bold, sharp lines. I am apologizing only in case I cannot settle my score with all three of you. Monsieur Athos has the first right to kill me, a fact which lessens the value of your claim, Monsieur Porthos, and makes yours, Monsieur Aramis, practically worthless. So I repeat, gentlemen, pray excuse me, but on that score alone, come, on guard. With these words, accompanied by the most gallant gesture, D'Artagnan drew his sword. The blood had rushed to his head. At that moment he would have tackled all the musketeers in the kingdom as cheerfully as he was about to try conclusions with Athos, Porthos and Aramis. It was high noon. The sun in its zenith beat mercilessly down upon the dueling ground. "It is very hot," Athos remarked, drawing his sword in his turn, "but I cannot take off my doublet. My wound has begun to bleed again and I would not wish to embarrass Monsieur by the sight of blood which he has not drawn from me himself." "True, Monsieur, and, whether drawn by myself or anyone else, I vow I will always view with regret the blood of so gallant a gentleman. I will therefore fight in my doublet, like yourself." Come, enough of such compliments," Porthos growled. "Remember we are awaiting our turn." "Speak for yourself, Porthos, when you utter such absurdities," Aramis broke in. "I, for one, hold that everything they said was well spoken and worthy of gallant gentlemen." "When you please, Monsieur," said Athos, putting himself on guard. "I was awaiting your orders, Monsieur," D'Artagnan replied, crossing swords. But the sound of the two blades clashing had barely died down when a company of the cardinal's guards, commanded by Monsieur de Gisques, turned the corner of the convent. The cardinal's guards, Porthos and Aramis, cried, "Sheathe your swords, gentlemen! Sheathe your swords!" But it was too late. The combatants had been seen in a position which left no doubt of their intentions. "Ho, there!" Gisques called, advancing toward them and making a sign to his men to follow him. "Hello, there, musketeers, so you're fighting here, are you? And the edicts against dueling, what about them?" "You are very generous, gentlemen of the guards," said Athos, full of rancor. For Gisques was one of those who had attacked him the day before. "If we saw you fighting, I can promise you we would not try to interfere. Leave us alone. Then, and you can enjoy a little fun without any trouble to yourselves." "Gentlemen," said Gisques, "I much regret to have to tell you that this is impossible. We have our duty to accomplish. Sheathe, then, if you please, and follow us." "Monsieur," said Aramis, parodying Gisques, "we would be delighted to obey your kindly invitation if it depended only upon ourselves, but unfortunately this is impossible. Monsieur de Treville has forbidden it. Be off on your way." "Then, it is the best thing to do." The raillery exasperated Gisques. "If you disobey," he warned, "we shall charge you. There are 5 of them," Athos said in a low voice, "and only 3 of us. We shall be beaten again and we shall die here and now, for I swear I will never again face our captain a beaten man." Athos, Porthos and Aramis huddled together as Gisques marshaled his men. This short interval was enough to convince D'Artagnan. Here was one of those events that decide a man's entire existence. D'Artagnan must choose between king and cardinal and forever abide by his choice. To fight meant to disobey the law, to risk his head, to attract in one instant the enmity of a minister more powerful than the king himself. He perceived all this quite clearly, and, to his credit, did not hesitate a second. Turning to the musketeers, "Gentlemen," he said, "allow me to correct you, if you please. You said you were but 3, it seems to me that there are 4 of us." "But you are not one of us," Porthos demurred. "True, I wear no musketeer's uniform but I have the spirit of a musketeer. My heart is a musketeer's, I feel it, Monsieur, and so I shall fight." "You may withdraw, young man," Gisques shouted, guessing D'Artagnan's intentions. "We will allow you to retire. Save your skin, lad. Be gone quickly." D'Artagnan did not budge. "Upon my word, you're a plucky fellow," said Athos, pressing the young man's hand. Come, make up your minds," Gisques urged. "Look here," Porthos said to Aramis. "We must do something. This is very magnanimous of you, Monsieur," Athos told D'Artagnan, but the 3 musketeers, realizing how young he was, dreaded his inexperience. Athos summed up the situation. We should still be but 3, one of whom is wounded, plus a mere boy. Yet everybody will say that there were 4 men fighting the guards. Yes, but shall we surrender? Porthos asked indignantly. That is difficult. Aramis agreed. D'Artagnan, understanding their irresolution, pressed his point. Try me, gentlemen, and I swear on my honor that I will not leave this field if we are vanquished. What is your name, my brave fellow? Athos inquired. D'Artagnan, monsieur. Well then, cried Athos. Athos, Porthos, Aramis and D'Artagnan. Forward. Come, along now, gentlemen. Have you made up your minds to make up your minds? Just cast for the 3rd time. We have, Athos replied. And what is your choice? We are about to have the honor of charging you. Aramis answered, raising his hat with one hand and drawing his sword with the other. So you're offering resistance, are you? God's blood, are you surprised? At once the 9 combatants rushed up to join battle furiously but not without method. Athos singled out a certain Cahusac, a favorite of the cardinals. Porthos paired off with Baccarat, and Aramis was faced with 2 adversaries. As for D'Artagnan, he was pitted against Gisque himself. The young Gascon's heart beat as though it would burst, not with fear, thank God, for he welcomed danger, but with emulation. He fought like a furious tiger, turning dozens of times around his opponent and continuously changing his ground and his guard. Gisque, to quote a phrase then in fashion, was an epicure of the blade and he had had much practice, yet it required all his skill to defend himself, for D'Artagnan was energetic and nimble, departing every instant from the accepted rules of technique, attacking him on all sides at once yet parrying like a man with the greatest respect for his own epidermis. At length these tactics exhausted Gisque's patience. Enraged at being held in check by an adversary he had dismissed as a mere boy, he lost his temper and began to make mistakes. D'Artagnan, though lacking in experience, was schooled in the soundest theory. The more wildly Gisque lunged, the more agile the Gascon became. Gisque, determined to have done with him, sprang forward and lunged to the full extent of his reach, aiming a terrible thrust at D'Artagnan. The latter whipped his blade under Gisque's, parrying in prime, and while Gisque was trying to get on guard again, D'Artagnan's blade darted like a serpent below Gisque's and passed through his body. Gisque fell like a log. D'Artagnan then cast a swift, anxious glance over the field of battle. Aramis had killed one of his opponents but the other was pressing him warmly. Nevertheless, Aramis was in good posture and able to look after himself. Baccarat and Porthos had just made counter-hits, Porthos receiving a thrust through his arm, Baccarat one through his thigh, but neither of these wounds was serious and they fought on ever more doggedly. Athos, wounded anew by Cahusac, grew increasingly pale but had not yielded an inch of ground. He had only changed his sword from one hand to the other and was now fighting with his left. According to the dueling laws then in force, D'Artagnan was at liberty to assist whom he pleased, while endeavoring to ascertain which of his comrades stood in greatest need. He caught a glance from Athos. Its expression was of sublime eloquence. Athos would have rather tried than appealed for help, but he could look and, in that look, ask for assistance. D'Artagnan, divining what Athos meant, sprang to Cahusac's side with a terrible bound, crying, "My turn, Monsieur le Garde, I am going to slay you." Cahusac wheeled about. D'Artagnan had intervened in the nick of time, for Athos, who had been fighting on sheer nerve, sank on one knee. "God's blood," he cried to D'Artagnan. "Don't kill him, lad. I have an old bone to pick with him when I am fit again. Just disarm him, make sure of his sword. That's it." "Oh, well done, well done." Athos gave vent to the last exclamation as he saw Cahusac's sword fly through the air and land 20 paces away. Both Cahusac and D'Artagnan leapt forward at the same time, the former to recover his weapon, the latter to capture it, but Dardanian, being more active, reached it first and placed his foot upon it. Cahusac ran over to the guardsman whom Aramis had killed, seized his rapier and returned toward Dardanian, but on the way he met Athos, who had recovered his breath during the short respite Dardanian had afforded him and who wished to resume the fight lest Dardanian kill Cahusac. Dardanian realized that he would be disobliging Athos not to leave him alone, and, a few minutes later, Cahusac fell, pinked in the throat. At the same instant Aramis placed his sword point on the breast of his fallen adversary and forced him to beg for mercy. This left only Porthos and Baccarat to be accounted for. Porthos was indulging in all manner of braggadocio and swagger, asking Baccarat what time of day it might be and congratulating him on the fact that his brother had just obtained a company in the regiment of Navarre. But, just as he might, he was making no headway, for Baccarat was one of those men of iron who never cry quits until they fall dead. Meanwhile it was imperative to finish the fighting soon. There was danger of the watch coming by and picking up all the duelists, wounded or not, royalists or cardinalists. Athos, Aramis and Dardanian, surrounding Baccarat, called on him to surrender. Though 1 against 4 and wounded in the thigh, Baccarat was determined to hold out. Gisc, rising on his elbow, cried out to him to yield. But Baccarat, like Dardanian, was a Gascon. He turned a deaf ear and laughed as though it was all a huge joke. Between two parries he even found time to point with his sword at a patch of earth and, parodying a verse from the Bible, declare macaronically, "Here shall Baccarat perish, alone of them which are beside him. But they are 4 to 1, Gisc remonstrated. Leave off, I command you. Oh, if you command me, that's another thing, Baccarat agreed. You are my superior officer, it is my duty to obey you. And, springing backward, he broke his sword across his knee to avoid having to surrender it, threw the 2 pieces over the convent wall, and crossed his arms, whistling a cardinalist air. Bravery is always honored even in an enemy. The Musketeers and Dardanian saluted Baccarat with their swords and returned them to their sheaths. Next, Dardanian, with the help of Baccarat, the only adversary still on his feet, carried Gisc, Cahusac and the guardsman Aramis had wounded, under the porch of the convent, leaving the dead man where he lay. Finally they rang the convent bell and, taking along 4 cardinalist swords as trophies of victory, they set out, wild with joy, for Monsieur de Treville's mansion. Arm in arm, they strode, occupying the whole width of the street and, as every musketeer they met swelled their ranks, in the end their progress was a triumphal march. Dardanian was delirious with happiness as he marched between Athos and Porthos, squeezing their arms affectionately. "If I'm not a musketeer yet," he told his new-found friends as they swung through the gateway of the Hotel de Treville, "at least I've begun my apprenticeship, don't you think?" Chapter 6. His Majesty King Louis XIII. The affair caused a sensation. In public Monsieur de Treville scolded them roundly, but he congratulated them in private. Then, as no time must be lost in reaching the king and winning him over, he hastened to the Louvre. It was too late. His Majesty was already closeted with my Lord Cardinal and too busy, he was told, to receive him. That evening he went to the king's gaming table. His Majesty was winning, and, being very miserly, was in an excellent humor. Seeing Monsieur de Treville at a distance, the king cried, "Come, Monsieur le Capitaine, come here so I may chide you. Do you know that His Eminence has been complaining again about your musketeers, Captain, and with such passion that he is out of sorts this evening? These musketeers of yours are devils incarnate and gallows birds all." Seeing at first glance how things would turn, Monsieur de Treville hastened to deny the accusation. On the contrary, he insisted, His soldiers were kindly creatures and meek as lambs. He would personally warrant that they had but one desire, namely to draw their swords only in His Majesty's service. But what were they to do? The cardinal's guards were forever picking quarrels with them, and they were obliged to defend themselves, if only for the honor of the corps. "Hark at Monsieur de Treville," the king commented. "Hark at the man." Anybody would imagine he was speaking about the members of a religious order. "In fact, my dear captain, I've a good mind to take away your commission and give it to Mademoiselle de Cameralt, to whom I promised an abbey. But I do not think I will take you at your word. I am called Louis le Just, and justice shall prevail. Monsieur, by and by we shall see. It is because of my faith in that justice, sire, that I shall calmly and patiently await the good pleasure of your Majesty." "Wait then, monsieur, wait. I shall not keep you long." Luck was turning against the king, as his winnings began to shrink. He was not sorry to find an excuse whereby to fare Charlemagne, to use a gambling term whose origin I do not know, but which means to leave the table when one is in pocket. His Majesty rose and, pocketing his winnings, turned to a courtier. "La Vieuville," he said, "take my place, for I must speak to Monsieur de Treville about an urgent matter." "Ah, I had 80 louis before me. Put down the same sum so that those who have lost money will have no cause for complaint. Justice comes first." Then, turning to Monsieur de Treville, he walked toward the window. "Well, monsieur, you say that His Most Illustrious Eminence's guards sought a quarrel with royal musketeers?" "Yes, sire. Just as they always do." "How did it happen? Tell me all about it. A judge must hear both sides of any question." "Well, sire, it was like this. 3 of my best soldiers, Athos, Porthos and Aramis, decided to go on a jaunt with a young fellow from Gascony to whom I had introduced them that morning. The party was to take place at Saint Germain, I believe, so they decided to meet at the Carmelite convent. Here they were molested by de Cahusk, by Carrot and 2 other guardsmen who certainly did not repair to such a place in such numbers without intending to flout the laws against dueling. I do not accuse them, sire, but I leave your Majesty to judge what 5 armed men could possibly want in so deserted a place as the convent pasture. Seeing my musketeers, the cardinalists changed their minds. Their private grievances gave way to party hatred. Treville, how sad to see 2 parties in France, 2 heads to 1 kingdom. But this can't go on forever. Your Majesty's servants devoutly hope so. So the cardinal's guards picked a quarrel with the king's musketeers? That probably happened, but I cannot swear to it. Sire, your Majesty knows how difficult it is to arrive at the truth, unless a man be gifted with that admirable instinct which has caused Louis XIII to be named Louis the Just. Right again, Treville, but your 3 musketeers were not alone. They had a youth with them. True, sire, but one of the 3 was wounded. Thus the royal musketeers were represented by 3 soldiers, one of whom was wounded, plus a mere stripling. They stood up to 5 of the cardinal's stoutest guardsmen and laid 4 of them low. What a victory for us! The king beamed. A complete victory, as complete a victory, sire, as Caesar won over Vercingetorix at the Bridge of 4 men, you say. One of them wounded. And a mere lad. A lad ridiculously young, sire, but he behaved so proudly on this occasion that I take the liberty of recommending him to your Majesty. His name? D'Artagnan, sire. The son of one of my oldest friends. The son of a man who served throughout the Civil War under His Majesty. Your father, of glorious memory. He acquitted himself well, eh? The king placed one hand on his hip and twirled his mustache with the other. Tell me more, Treville. You know how much I enjoy tales of fighting and warfare. As I told you, sire, D'Artagnan is little more than a boy, as he has not the honor of being a musketeer. He was in civilian dress. The cardinal's guardsmen, realizing at once that he was very young indeed and that he did not belong to the corps of Musketeers, invited him to withdraw before they attacked. Aha, you see, Treville, it was they who attacked. Eh? That is quite clear. Eh? It is, sire. Well, when they called on him to withdraw, he told them that he was a musketeer at heart, that he was wholly devoted to the king, and that he chose to remain with his majesty's servants. A brave lad, he was as good as his word. Sire, your majesty can be proud of him. He pinked the Jisk, to the cardinal's vast annoyance. He wounded the Jisk? He, a mere boy? The Jisk, one of the top swordsmen in the kingdom. Well, sire, this youth felled the Jisk. I want to see him. Treville, I want to see him. If anything can be done, we shall make it our business. When will your majesty deign to receive him? Tomorrow at noon. Treville, shall I bring him alone? No, bring all four of them. I wish to thank them at once. Loyal servants are rare. They deserve to be rewarded. We shall report at noon tomorrow, sire. Good, the king said, then fidgeting nervously. The back staircase. Treville, come up the back staircase. There's no point in letting his eminence know. Of course, sire. You understand, Treville. An edict is an edict and, after all, dueling has been banned. But this was no duel, sire. It was a brawl. The proof is that 5 of the cardinal's guards set upon my 3 musketeers and Monsieur d'Artagnan. Quite so, the king agreed. All the same, Treville, make sure to take the back staircase. Treville smiled at the monarch's weakness, but there was satisfaction in his smile, too, for he felt he had accomplished something by prevailing upon this child to rebel against his master. That evening the 4 stalwarts were informed of the honor bestowed upon them. Having been long acquainted with the king, the musketeers were not particularly impressed, but D'Artagnan, his Gascon imagination aflame, saw in this summons the making of his future fortune. All night long, he dreamed golden dreams. By 8 o'clock next morning he was calling for Athos. He found him fully dressed and ready to go out, as their audience with the king was not till noon. Athos had arranged to play tennis with Porthos and Aramis at a court near the Luxembourg stables. He invited D'Artagnan to join them. The Gascon, ignorant of a game he had never played, nevertheless accepted. What else was he to do during the next 4 hours? Porthos and Aramis were already on the court, playing together. Athos, who was an excellent athlete, passed over to the other side and, with D'Artagnan as a partner, challenged them. But though Athos played with his left hand, his first shot convinced him that his wound was still too recent to permit of such exertion. D'Artagnan therefore remained alone and, as he declared his complete ignorance of the game, they simply tried rallying, without scoring their points. A smashing ball from Porthos just missed hitting D'Artagnan in the face. Had it done so, D'Artagnan would have been compelled to forego his audience with the king. As in his Gascon imagination his whole future life depended upon this meeting, he bowed politely to Porthos and Aramis, declaring that he would not resume the game until he knew enough about it to play with them on equal terms. Then he returned to a seat in the gallery close to the court. Unfortunately for D'Artagnan, one of his Eminence's guards was among the spectators, still chafing at the defeat his comrades had suffered just the day before. He had promised himself to seize the earliest opportunity to obtain revenge. He now saw his chance, and, turning to his neighbor, "I am not surprised this youth is afraid of a tennis ball," he drawled. "He must surely be apprentice musketeer." D'Artagnan started as though a serpent had stung him, then he turned and stared at the guardsman. "La," the cardinalist continued, twirling his mustache insolently. "You may stare at me as long as you like, my little gentleman. I have said what I have said. Your words are too clear to require commentary." D'Artagnan replied, "I beg you to follow me out of here." And when, Pray? The guardsman asked banteringly. At once, if you please. By the way, do you know who I am? I haven't the faintest idea and I don't care. You're wrong, there. If you knew my name, perhaps you would be more careful. What is your name? Bernajux. At your service. Well, Monsieur Bernajux, I shall wait for you at the door. Proceed. Monsieur, I shall join you in a minute. Do not hurry, monsieur. We must not be seen going out together. Any witnesses at our interview might cramp our style. True, true, the guardsman agreed. He was surprised that his name had made no impression on the Gascon, for he was known to everybody, everywhere, with perhaps the solitary exception of D'Artagnan. His Eminence the Cardinal might heap up edicts against dueling to his heart's content. Bernajux continued to figure as instigator or liquidator of daily brawls. Porthos and Aramis were so intent on their game and Athos so busy observing them that they did not notice D'Artagnan's exit. True to his word, D'Artagnan stood by the door, waiting. A moment later, Bernajux joined him, with no time to lose because of his audience with the king. D'Artagnan looked up and down the street, found it empty, and decided to fight then and there. Upon my word, though you may be called Bernajux, he said, it is lucky you have only a apprentice musketeer to deal with. But never mind, I shall do my best. On guard, please. This is no place to fight. The other objected. We would be better off behind the Abbey of Saint-Germain or in the Pré-aux-Clercs. What you say makes excellent sense. D'Artagnan agreed. Unfortunately, I have very little time to spare. I have an appointment at 12 sharp. On guard. Then, monsieur, I beg you. Bernajux was not the man to entertain two requests to draw. An instant later, his sword glittered in the sunlight and he swooped down on D'Artagnan, thinking to intimidate him, but D'Artagnan had served his apprenticeship the day before, fresh from a spectacular victory and fired by hopes of favors soon forthcoming. He was determined not to budge an inch, so the two swords were hilt to hilt and, as D'Artagnan stood his ground, it was Bernajux who had to retreat. In doing so, Bernajux's sword deviated from the line of guard. D'Artagnan at once freed his blade by passing it under his adversary's, and lunged, pinking Bernajux on the shoulder. Then D'Artagnan stepped back and, according to the rights of dueling, raised his sword to salute his defeated foe. But Bernajux would have none of it. Assuring D'Artagnan that he was unscathed, he rushed blindly at him, actually spitting himself upon the Gascon's sword. As he did not fall, he refused to declare himself conquered. Instead, he kept retreating towards the mansion of the Duc de la Trémouille, in whose service he had a relative. D'Artagnan, unaware of how serious Bernajux's wounds were, kept pressing him and would no doubt have struck him a third deadly blow. But the noise from the street had reached the tennis court. Two fellow cardinalists, who had seen Bernajux leave after an exchange of words with D'Artagnan, rushed out, sword in hand, and swept down upon him. Close on their heels came Athos, Porthos and Aramis and, just as the cardinalists attacked D'Artagnan, the three musketeers intervened to drive them back. Bernajux suddenly fell, exhausted, since there were now 4 royalists against 2 cardinalists. The latter cried for help, anew, L'Hôtel de la Trémouille, to the rescue, to the rescue. Immediately, all those in Monsieur de la Trémouille's mansion, coming to the aid of the cardinalists, fell upon the victors. Our 4 friends set up an antiphonal cry, anew, masked airs, summoning their comrades to the fight. This appeal was widely and briskly heeded, for the Musketeers, notorious foes of His Eminence, were correspondingly popular. Usually men from the royal companies of guards cast their lot in with the Musketeers against the henchmen of the man Aramis had dubbed the Red Duke. 3 guardsmen from the company of Monsieur des Essarts happened to be passing. Two of them immediately joined in the fray while the third ran off to the Hôtel de Treville to seek reinforcements. As usual, there were plenty of musketeers on the premises. They ran to their comrades with help and the melee became general. Very soon, the musketeers and their allies prevailed. The cardinal's guardsmen and Monsieur de la Trémouille's servants beat a hasty retreat into the Hôtel de la Trémouille, slamming the gates just in time to prevent their pursuers from entering after them. As for Bernajoux, he had been picked up and conveyed to safety early in the battle. His condition was critical. Excitement was at its height among the musketeers and their supporters. Somebody suggested that they set fire to the Trémouille mansion to punish Monsieur de la Trémouille's servants for their insolence in daring to make a sally against the royal musketeers. The motion, duly seconded, was received enthusiastically. Ways and means were being blithely debated, when, as luck would have it, the clock struck 11. D'Artagnan and his friends recalled their audience with the king, and because they could not fight it out then and there, they prevailed on their friends to retire. The royalists decided to hurl some paving stones against the gates, but the gates were too solid and they soon tired of the sport. Besides, the leaders of the enterprise had left the group and were on their way to the Hôtel de Treville. Arriving there, they found the captain of musketeers awaiting them. He was already informed of their latest escapade. "Quick, to the Louvre," he said. "We must get there before the king has been influenced by his eminence. We will describe this business as a consequence of yesterday's trouble and pass the two off together." Accordingly, the four young men and their commanding officer set off for the royal palace. To Monsieur de Treville's amazement, he was told that the king had gone stag hunting in the forest of Saint-Germain. Monsieur de Treville asked to have this information repeated to him no less than twice. Each time, his companions noticed that his face darkened. "Did His Majesty plan yesterday to go hunting?" "No, Your Excellency. It was all quite sudden," the valet replied. "The master of hounds called this morning to say that he had marked down a stag last night for His Majesty's benefit. At first the king said he would not go, but he could not resist a day's hunting, so he left shortly after dinner." "Did His Majesty see the cardinal?" "Most probably, Your Excellency," the valet answered. "I saw His Eminence's horses being harnessed. I asked where he was going and they told me to Saint-Germain. The cardinal has stolen a march on us," Monsieur de Treville told his protégés. "I shall see His Majesty this evening, gentlemen, but I advise you not to venture to do so." This advice from a man who knew the king only too well was unassailable. They agreed to return home to await further developments. For his part, Monsieur de Treville determined that he had best register an immediate complaint. He therefore dispatched a servant with a letter to Monsieur de la Trémouille, begging him to expel the cardinal's guards from his house and to rebuke his servants for their audacity in making a sortie against the royal musketeers. But Monsieur de la Trémouille, already prejudiced by his esquire, Bernajoux' kinsman, replied that neither Monsieur de Treville nor his soldiers had reason for complaint. On the contrary, he, de la Trémouille, was the offended party because the musketeers had assailed his servitors and planned to burn his mansion. The debate between these two nobles might have been endlessly protracted, as each, quite naturally, persisted in his opinion. Happily Monsieur de Treville imagined an expedient likely to end it quickly. He would go personally to call upon Monsieur de la Trémouille. The two nobles exchanged polite greetings, for, though they were not friends, they respected each other. Both were men of courage and honor, and as Monsieur de la Trémouille was a Protestant, saw the king seldom, and belonged to no party, he generally allowed no bias to affect his social relations. On this occasion, however, his manner, though courteous, was cooler than usual. "Monsieur," said the captain of musketeers, "each of us believes that he has cause for complaint against the other. I have come here to attempt to clear up our misunderstanding. I am perfectly willing, Monsieur, but I warn you that I have made inquiries and that the fault lies wholly with your musketeers. You are too fair-minded and reasonable a man, monsieur, not to entertain a proposition I should like to make. Make it, monsieur, I am at your service. How is Monsieur Bernajux, your esquire's kinsman? Very ill indeed. His wound in the arm is not dangerous, but he was run through the lungs too, and the doctor is much alarmed. Is he still conscious? Certainly. Can he talk? Yes, but with difficulty. Well, monsieur, let us go to his bedside and call upon him to tell us the truth in the name of that God whom he may have to face all too soon. I am perfectly willing to let him judge his own cause and to abide by whatever he says. Monsieur de la Tremouille thought the matter over for a moment, found the suggestion eminently reasonable, and agreed. Together he and Treville repaired to the sick room. As they entered, the patient tried desperately to rise in his bed, but his strength failed him. Exhausted, he fell back on the pillows. Monsieur de la Tremouille picked up a vial of salts and pressed it against Bernajoux' nostrils. In a few moments the guardsman came to. Unwilling to appear to be exerting pressure, the captain of Musketeers suggested that Monsieur de la Tremouille himself question Bernajoux. The upshot of it all was exactly as Treville had foreseen. Hovering between life and death, Bernajoux made a clean breast of everything that had occurred. This was all that Monsieur de Treville desired. Wishing Bernajoux a speedy convalescence, he took leave of Monsieur de la Tremouille, returned to his mansion, and immediately sent word to the 4 friends, inviting them to dinner. The captain of Musketeers entertained the most distinguished company in Paris, short of cardinalists. Quite naturally, therefore, the conversation throughout dinner dealt with the 2 setbacks His Eminence's guards had suffered. D'Artagnan, as the hero of both fights, was showered with congratulations, to the delight of Athos, Porthos and Aramis. It was not out of good fellowship alone that they envied him no whit of his success. They had themselves so often had their turn in similar circumstances that they could well afford to leave him his turn. Towards 6 o'clock, Monsieur de Treville announced that it was time to go to the Louvre. The hour of the audience granted by His Majesty was long since past, so instead of claiming entrance up the back staircase, he led the 4 young men into the antechamber. The king had not returned from hunting. The courtiers and others waited for about a half hour. Suddenly all the doors were thrown open and an usher announced His Majesty the King. D'Artagnan trembled with anticipation. He was thrilled to the core, for he felt that the next few minutes would probably decide the rest of his life. Anxiously, he stared at the doorway through which the monarch was to enter. Louis XIII appeared, his henchman in his wake. He was clad in dusty hunting dress. His high boots reached over his knees and he held a riding crop in his right hand. At first glance D'Artagnan realized that His Majesty was very much out of sorts. The royal displeasure, obvious though it was, did not prevent the courtiers from lining up, right and left, to form a human avenue down which His Majesty might proceed. At court, it is better to be noticed even with an angry eye than not to be seen at all. The 3 musketeers, therefore, did not hesitate to step forward. As for D'Artagnan, he stood behind them. Though the king knew Athos, Porthos and Aramis, he swept by without a word or glance of recognition, but as he passed Monsieur de Treville and looked at him a moment, Treville outstared his master. Grumbling, His Majesty entered his apartment. "Things are going badly," Athos commented, smiling. "We shall not be appointed chevaliers of the royal order this time. Wait here for about 10 minutes, Monsieur de Treville told his protégés. "If I do not return by then, it will be useless to stay on. Go back to the Hôtel de Treville." Obediently they waited 10 minutes, 15, 20. Finally, apprehensive of what might be happening, they withdrew. Monsieur de Treville marched boldly into the king's rooms to find a very glum Majesty, ensconced in an armchair. beating his boots with the handle of his riding crop. This did not prevent the captain of Musketeers from inquiring phlegmatically after the royal health. "Bad, monsieur. Bad as can be," the king answered. "I am bored. I am bored stiff." Indeed, Louis XIII suffered chronically from ennui. Often he would lead a courtier to the window, invite him to gaze out upon the scene below, and say, "Monsieur, let us suffer boredom together." "What, bored? I thought your majesty had been enjoying the pleasures of hunting." "Pleasures, monsieur? Fine pleasures indeed. I don't know whether it's because the game leaves no scent or because the dogs have no noses, but everything is a satori. We started a stag of 10 branches and chased him for 6 hours. We were just about to take him. Saint Simon was raising his horn to blow the mort, when before we could catch our breath, the whole pack took to the wrong scent and dashed off after a 2-year-old. I shall be forced to give up hunting just as I had to give up falconry. Ah, I am a very unhappy monarch, monsieur. I had only one gyrfalcon and he died the day before yesterday." "Indeed, sire, I understand your discomfort. It was a great misfortune. But you still have a number of falcons, sparrowhawks and tiercents, and not a man to train them. Falconers are disappearing. I alone know the noble art of venery. Let me die and all will be over. People will hunt with gins, snares and traps. If I only had time to train a few pupils, but no. The cardinal will not give me a moment's respite. What with his talk about Austria, his talk about England, his talk about Spain. Ah, speaking of his eminence, I am much annoyed at you, Monsieur de Treville." Here was the chance Monsieur de Treville had been waiting for. Knowing the king of old, he realized that all these complaints were but a prelude and a means whereby his master roused himself to the proper pitch of anger. "Have I been so unfortunate as to incur your majesty's displeasure?" asked the captain of Musketeers, feigning the greatest astonishment, without replying directly to the question. "Is this how you perform your duties, monsieur?" The king continued. "Did I appoint you captain of Musketeers so that your men should assassinate a soldier, disturb a whole quarter and try to set fire to Paris, while you stand by without opening your mouth?" The king paused a moment, then added judiciously, "But perhaps I am too hasty in rebuking you. Doubtless the writers are in prison and you have come to tell me that justice has been done." "Sire," Monsieur de Treville answered calmly, "on the contrary, I have come to ask you for justice." "Against whom?" "Against slanderers." Well, here is something new. I suppose you are going to tell me that your 3 damned musketeers, Athos, Porthos and Aramis, plus your lad from Bern, did not fall upon poor Bernjux like so many maniacs? I suppose they didn't treat him so roughly that by this time he is probably dead? I suppose they didn't lay siege to the mansion of the Duc de la Trémouille and even attempt to burn it? This would be no great misfortune in time of war, for the place is a nest of Huguenots, but in times of peace, what a frightful example! Come now, can you deny this? Who told you this fine story, sire? Who told me this fine story? Who but one who watches while I sleep, who labors while I amuse myself, and who governs everything at home and abroad, in France and in all Europe? Your Majesty is doubtless referring to God, for I know no one save God who stands so high above your Majesty. No, monsieur, I mean the prop of the state, my only servant, my only friend, the Cardinal. His Eminence is not His Holiness, sire. What do you mean by that, monsieur? I mean that only the Pope is infallible and that his infallibility does not extend to cardinals. Do you propose to tell me that the Cardinal is misleading me? You are accusing him, eh? Come, speak up, tell me frankly, are you accusing him? No, sire. But I say that the Cardinal has been misled. I say that he is ill-informed. I say that he was over-hasty in accusing His Majesty's Musketeers, that he is unjust to them, and, I repeat, that he has not gone to the proper sources for his information. The accusation comes from Monsieur de la Tremouille himself. What do you say to that? I might answer, sire, that he is personally too much involved in the matter to be a very impartial witness. But I shall do nothing of the kind, for I know Tremouille to be a loyal gentleman. I therefore refer the whole thing to him, but on one condition, sire, which is that your Majesty will summon him here, that you will question him in private, and that I may see your Majesty as soon as you have seen him. What? You will subscribe to anything Monsieur de la Tremouille may say? Yes, sire. You will abide by his advice? Absolutely. And you will agree to any conditions he sets? Certainly. La Chesnay. The king called La Chesnay, the monarch's confidential valet, who never left the door, entered the room. La Chesnay, said the king, send somebody immediately to find Monsieur de la Tremouille. I wish to speak to him this evening. As the valet withdrew, the captain of Musketeers turned to the king. Your Majesty promises not to see anyone else in the meantime? I promise. Tomorrow. Then, sire? Until tomorrow, monsieur. At what time, if it please your Majesty? At any hour you will. But if I came too early, I would be afraid of awakening your Majesty. Afraid of awakening me? Do I ever sleep? No, monsieur. It is a long time since I had a good night's rest. I sometimes doze. That is all? Come as early as you like, say at 7, but heaven help you if your musketeers are guilty. If my musketeers are guilty, sire, the culprits shall be delivered into your Majesty's hands for you to dispose of them at your pleasure. Does your Majesty require anything further? You have but to speak, sire. I am ready to obey. No, monsieur, no, I am not called Louis the Just without reason. Tomorrow. Then, monsieur, until tomorrow. Till then, and God preserve your Majesty. Poorly though the king might sleep, Monsieur de Treville slept still worse. At 6:30 next morning, the 3 musketeers and D'Artagnan were awaiting him. He took them with him but gave no encouragement and made no promises, nor did he hide the fact that their luck, and even his own, depended on a throw of the dice. At the foot of the rear stairway, he asked them to wait. If the king was still angry at them, they could depart unseen. If his Majesty consented to receive them, they had only to be called. In the king's private antechamber, Monsieur de Treville learned from La Chesnay that they had not been able to reach Monsieur de la Tremouille at his mansion the night before, that he had returned too late to obey the summons, that he had only just arrived, and was even now closeted with his Majesty. The captain of Musketeers was highly pleased at this news, for he could be certain that no foreign suggestion could insinuate itself between Monsieur de la Tremouille's testimony and himself. In fact, after some 10 minutes, the door of the king's closet opened and the Duc de la Tremouille came out. Monsieur de Treville, said the Duke, His Majesty has just sent for me to inquire into the circumstances of what happened yesterday morning at my mansion. I told the king the truth, namely that the fault lay with my people and that I was ready to apologize. Since I have the good fortune to meet you here, I beg you to forgive me and to consider me always your friend. Monsieur le Duc, Treville replied, I was so confident of your loyalty that I asked for no other defender before His Majesty. I see that I was not mistaken. I thank you. There is still one man in France who measures up to what I said of you. Well spoken, cried the king. Since he claims to be a friend of yours, Treville, tell him I should like to be a friend of his, but he neglects me. Why, it is nearly 3 years since I saw him last. My thanks, sire, my warmest thanks. Of course I do not refer to Monsieur de Treville, but I beg your Majesty to believe that those whom you see at all hours of the day are not your most devoted servants. So, you heard what I said, Monsieur le Duc. So much the better, so much the better. The king declared. Well, Treville, where are your musketeers? I told you the day before yesterday to bring them along. Why haven't you done so, pray? They are downstairs, sire, and with your permission La Chesnay will bid them come up. Yes, let them come up immediately. It is almost 8 o'clock and I expect another visitor at 9. Go, Monsieur le Duc, and please come back to see me occasionally. Come in, Treville. The Duke saluted and retired. As he opened the door, the 3 Musketeers and D'Artagnan, escorted by La Chesnay, appeared at the top of the staircase. Come in, my brave lads, the king called. Come in, I am going to scold you. The Musketeers advanced bowing, D'Artagnan close behind them. What the devil? The king exclaimed. 7 of his eminences, guards crushed by you 4 in 2 days? That's too many, gentlemen, too many. If you go on at that rate, the cardinal will have to recruit a new corps and I to apply the dueling edicts with utmost severity. 1 man, now and then, I don't mind much, but 7 in 2 days, I repeat, is too many, much too many. As your majesty sees, my men have come, contrite and repentant, to make their apologies. A fig for their contrition and repentance, the king said. I placed no confidence in their hypocritical faces, particularly that Gascon face over there. Come here, Monsieur D'Artagnan, aware that the compliment was addressed to him and assuming a most shamefaced air, came forward. Why, you told me he was a young man. This is a boy, Treville, a mere boy. Do you mean to say it was he who dealt just that master stroke? Yes, and he accounted for Bernajoux as well. Indeed, and besides this, Athos put in, had he not rescued me from Baccarat, I would certainly not have the honor of making my very humble obeisance to your majesty at this moment. La, this lad from Bern is a very devil. Ventre Saint Gris, as the king my father used to say. I suppose this sort of work involves the slashing of many doublets and the breaking of many swords, and Gascons are always poor, are they not, sire? I can guarantee that they have not yet discovered any gold mines in their mountains. Yet God owes them this miracle as a reward for the way they champion the king, your father, which amounts to saying that the Gascons mean a king of me too, for I am my father's son, eh? Treville, well, that's all true and I shall not deny it. La Chesnay, go rummage through all my pockets and see if you can find 40 pistoles. If you do, bring me the money. And now, let us see, young man, your hand upon your conscience, tell me exactly how all this came about. D'Artagnan related the adventure of the day before in full detail. How he had been unable to sleep for joy at his approaching audience with his majesty. How he had called in his friends 3 hours before the appointment. How they had gone to the tennis court together. How, afraid of being struck in the face by a ball, he had been ridiculed by Bernajoux. How Bernajoux had very nearly paid for his jeers with his life. And finally how Monsieur de la Trémouille, who had had nothing to do with the matter, almost lost his mansion because of it. That is what I fancied, the king murmured. Your account agrees in every particular with Trémouille's. Poor cardinal, 7 men in 2 days, and his very best men, too. But, that will do, gentlemen, you hear, that will do. You had taken your revenge for the affair of the roof and even exceeded it. You ought to be satisfied. If your majesty is, then so are we, said Monsieur de Treville. Yes, I am quite satisfied. Taking a handful of gold from La Chesnay and putting it into D'Artagnan's hand, here you are, the king said. Here is a proof of my satisfaction. The notions of pride which are universally observed today did not prevail in the 17th century. Gentlemen received gifts of money from the king's hand without feeling in any way humiliated. D'Artagnan pocketed his 40 pistoles without scruple. On the contrary, he thanked his majesty heartily. There, said the king looking at the clock. There, now that it's 8:30, you may withdraw. I told you I was expecting a caller at 9. Thank you for your devotedness, gentlemen. I can continue to rely upon it, can I not? The four assured His Majesty that nothing was too much to do in his service, that their loyalty was boundless and that, for his sake, they would allow themselves to be cut to pieces. Good, good, but keep whole, that will be better and you will be more useful to me. As they retired, he turned to Treville, and added, in a low voice, I know you have no room in the Musketeers. And besides, we decided that a trial period elsewhere is necessary before entering that corps, so I beg you to place this young man in the company of guards commanded by Monsieur Dessarts, your brother-in-law. The captain of Musketeers nodded affirmatively. Ah, Treville, I rejoice at the face His Eminence will make when he finds us out. He will be furious, but I don't care. I am doing what is right. The king waved goodbye to Treville who, joining the four companions, found D'Artagnan dividing his 40 pistoles among them. As His Majesty had foreseen, the cardinal was really furious, so furious, indeed, that for a week he kept away from the king's gaming table. This did not prevent the king from being as affable to him as possible whenever they met or from asking him in the most kindly tone, well, Monsieur le Cardinal, how fares it with that poor Bernajoux, and that poor Gisque of yours?